July 12, 1981. Norwegian Sea. Above the thermocline, the water was a cold, metallic gray, flat and indifferent, while hundreds of meters below, a Soviet Victor-class attack submarine advanced at a cautious crawl. Its crew had been told this region was patrolled, but not saturated. They believed that if they stayed deep, quiet, and predictable, the ocean itself would mask them from Western detection. For decades, this assumption had shaped Soviet submarine doctrine. Depth and silence were their shield, and the North Atlantic's harsh acoustics were their ally. But on that July morning, something shifted. A faint tremor ran through the hull, barely perceptible, the kind of vibration only sonar operators would notice. It wasn't danger, not yet, but it was unfamiliar. Within minutes, the operators reported an intermittent pattern of distant acoustic contacts. Not a warship, not a submarine, something else, something above. They couldn't classify it. Soviet crews were trained to identify propeller signatures, cavitation trails, transient noises from other submarines or passing merchant ships. But this sound was different. Small splashes, faint impacts, rhythmic dispersions drifting downward through the layers of the sea. They had no idea they were hearing sonobuoys. The P3 Orion flying thousands of feet above them was never seen, never heard in the conventional sense. Its engines were too distant, its airframe too far removed from submarine sensors to register as a threat. Instead, what the Victor's crew picked up was the acoustic footprint of a coordinated pattern buoys seated across the water, each one listening, each one transmitting, forming a floating lattice of ears. And once that pattern began to close, the submarine's supposed invisibility became an illusion. The Soviet captain slowed further, believing caution would help. Instead, it only sharpened the contact picture for the aircraft above. In the P3's cabin, analysts observed the submarine's movements in near real time through the sonobuoy network, translating every shift of the Soviet vessel into a developing track. Nothing the Victor did, not silence, not depth, not subtle maneuvering, could break free of the acoustic net. And as the crew felt those faint splashes drifting down again, they began to realize that this was not random ocean noise. Something was mapping them, something that didn't need to see them at all. And that growing awareness, more than anything, would reshape Soviet understanding of underwater warfare. For Soviet naval planners, the ocean had always been both shield and weapon. Since the late 1950s, the Soviet Navy accepted one unavoidable truth. In a nuclear confrontation, their ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs, had to survive long enough to fire. Everything else in the fleet existed to protect that mission. But survival in the deep depended on a single assumption. If a submarine could not be seen, it could not be hunted. And if it could not be hunted, it could not be destroyed before launching its missiles. This belief shaped the very architecture of the Soviet submarine force. Their boats were built large and fast, designed to outrun or outdive Western attackers. Their acoustics were considered acceptable, not optimal. What mattered most, Soviet doctrine argued, was speed, depth, and the ability to maneuver aggressively. Silence was a secondary virtue, useful but not decisive. The ocean was vast, unpredictable, and hostile. They assumed no aircraft, no surface vessel, no distant adversary could reliably hold a submerged submarine by sound alone. By the early 1970s, this assumption was already cracking. U.S. Navy acoustic research was advancing faster than Soviet estimates predicted. Sonar processing, once limited to small teams on destroyers, became systematized, networked, and enhanced by computing power. Techniques like passive ranging, low-frequency analysis, and convergent zone tracking were turning underwater acoustics into something closer to a science than an art. And as American subs grew quieter, the contrast exposed how noisy many Soviet designs truly were. But the most decisive revolution came not from ships or submarines, but from the air. Maritime patrol aircraft like the P3 Orion evolved into platforms that could deploy vast fields of listening devices, sonobuoys that transformed entire stretches of ocean into acoustic surveillance zones. Instead of hunting with a single ear, the U.S. Navy now hunted with hundreds. No amount of speed or depth could outrun a pattern. The ocean itself became an extension of American sensing capability. Soviet commanders were beginning to grasp the implications. Reports circulated about submarine patrols cut short, unexpected detections, and aircraft appearing precisely where no aircraft should have known to be. These were not coincidences. They were indicators of a new strategic reality. The Americans were building a system designed not to find submarines occasionally, but to track them consistently. And as this realization spread through the ranks, the question shifted from, why were we detected? To something far more unsettling. How early did they start listening? That answer would become clear once crews understood what the P3 Orion actually brought into the fight. The P3 Orion appeared, at a glance, to be an unremarkable aircraft. A turboprop patrol plane with a long fuselage and broad wings, it resembled a civilian airliner more than a frontline weapon of the Cold War. Yet beneath its familiar profile, the P3 carried the most sophisticated anti-submarine warfare suite of its era. Its true power was not in its engines or airframe, but in the way it transformed the ocean into a sensor field. The Orion's greatest strength lay in its ability to deploy sonobuoys, expendable listening devices engineered to drift with the sea. Dropped in patterns that spanned entire kilometers, they created scalable acoustic grids. Each buoy listened, recorded, and transmitted data upward. Some were tuned for low-frequency noise, others for high-frequency transients. Together, they produced a layered auditory picture of the underwater battlespace. Systems like Jezebel and Cadillac revolutionized how this information was processed. Instead of human ears alone, computers now broke down acoustic signatures, compared them against vast libraries, and identified patterns invisible to traditional sonar operators. A Soviet submarine turning a propeller blade at a specific RPM, or generating a faint harmonic from a pump system, could now be recognized and classified from miles away. The aircraft became a flying command post for acoustic forensics. But the P3 did more than passively listen. Equipped with a magnetic anomaly detector, MADBOOM extending from its tail, it could sense minute disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field caused by a submarine's metal hull. MAD had limited range, hundreds of meters, not miles, but when used at the final stage of a hunt, it closed the loop that sonobuoys had opened. A submarine's last refuge, deep, silent water, became a shrinking sanctuary. This multi-layered detection system created something entirely new: persistent tracking. The P3 did not need to follow a submarine continuously. It only needed enough data points to predict where it would be next. With sonobuoy fields spread across choke points like the GIUK Gap, Soviet submarines crossing into the Atlantic could be monitored long before they approached patrol stations. Their routes, speeds, and behavioral patterns became predictable. For Soviet crews, it meant that even the most cautious patrol could be exposed long before they sensed danger. The Americans weren't simply finding submarines. They were mapping their movements as if drawing lines on a chart. And soon, real incidents would drive home just how broad and precise this acoustic net had become. The first wave of incidents emerged quietly, buried in after-action reports that circulated only within the Soviet Navy's upper echelons. A Victor-class submarine operating north of Scotland reported being unexpectedly localized by foreign forces despite maintaining recommended quieting procedures. A month later, a Yankee-class ballistic missile submarine encountered what the crew described as persistent overhead acoustic activity, a vague phrase masking the unsettling truth that an aircraft had tracked them without ever being detected in return. By the late 1970s, such encounters were no longer isolated. They were systemic. One of the clearest examples came from a 1977 patrol in the Norwegian Sea, where a Charlie-class submarine attempted to transit toward the Atlantic. The crew later recounted hearing intermittent, faint splashes, unclassified at first, then recognized as consistent with sonobuoy deployment. Hours later, they noticed clean positional fixes by NATO aircraft. It became evident that the P3 Orion had maintained a shadow trail, handing off tracking responsibilities as crews rotated, creating almost continuous monitoring. The submarine had never revealed itself through aggressive maneuvers. It had been detected simply by its acoustic signature, captured, recorded, and relayed through the buoy network. Another case involved a Delta I-class SSBN returning from patrol. Despite following a pre-approved, low-speed route designed to minimize noise, the submarine found a P-3 repeatedly reappearing above it during different legs of the transit. Soviet analysts concluded that the Americans had acquired the Delta's acoustic profile early and projected its path with sufficient accuracy to re-establish contact multiple times. For a platform carrying nuclear weapons, this was deeply troubling. An SSBN's survivability depended on uncertainty. A predictable missile submarine was a vulnerable one. Then came the incident that circulated through nearly every Soviet submarine wardroom. A Victor III detected by sound alone while attempting to exploit a strong thermocline for concealment. The crew believed they had achieved acoustic masking. Instead, the P-3's buoy field resolved their position with unexpected clarity. One officer later wrote that the experience altered our understanding of underwater invisibility. They had not been hunted by a destroyer or a rival submarine. They had been held at range calmly and methodically by an aircraft they could not touch. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. American aircraft were not stumbling upon submarines. They were demonstrating a technological mastery that reduced entire patrols to predictable trajectories on a map. And as these incidents accumulated, Soviet leadership began demanding answers. Answers that required confronting limitations in their own designs. As reports of unexpected detections mounted, Soviet engineers and naval strategists were forced to confront a problem they had long recognized but never fully resolved: noise. Soviet submarines, powerful and fast, carried design philosophies rooted in the belief that superior depth and aggressive maneuvering could offset acoustic shortcomings. But the United States had built an entire system around detecting precisely those shortcomings, and by the early 1980s that system had matured into a global surveillance mechanism. In response, the Soviets initiated a series of countermeasures aimed at reducing their submarines' acoustic signatures. The introduction of anechoic tiles, for example, was meant to absorb active sonar pulses and dampen outgoing noise. Early variants performed unevenly. Some degraded quickly in cold waters. Others failed to adhere properly, but they represented a shift toward prioritizing stealth. Propeller designs were revisited, with an emphasis on minimizing cavitation at patrol speeds. Internal machinery was increasingly mounted on rafts to reduce hull vibrations. The direction was correct, but implementation lagged behind American progress. More ambitious solutions followed. The Project 705 Alpha class, with its titanium hull and liquid metal-cooled reactor, was conceived as a radical answer to Western tracking. Its extraordinary speed and acceleration theoretically allowed it to outrun or outmaneuver aircraft-guided torpedoes. Yet the very features that made it technologically remarkable also made it loud. In open water conditions, its acoustic profile stood out sharply against ambient noise, turning it into a uniquely detectable target. American sonobuoy operators regarded Alpha signatures as distinctive, almost unmistakable. Later designs, most notably the Akula class, finally closed much of the acoustic gap. The first Akulas were significantly quieter than previous Soviet submarines, and Western analysts recognized them as the most serious undersea challenge the U.S. Navy had yet faced. However, they arrived late in the Cold War and in limited numbers, unable to fully offset the decades-long American investment in acoustic tracking. Meanwhile, the P3 Orion continued evolving. Improved processors, refined sonobuoy patterns, and expanding acoustic libraries meant that even incremental Soviet improvements took time to make an impact. A submarine that became marginally quieter simply shifted into a new classification bracket, a new signature to catalog, analyze, and track. For crews operating older designs, especially Victors, Charlies, and Deltas, the situation remained sobering. No matter how carefully they adjusted speed, machinery settings, or depth, the Americans often reacquired them. And each reacquisition reinforced a demoralizing truth. The contest was not between individual submarines and aircraft, but between entire technological systems. And as this system matured, it reshaped not only tactics and design priorities, but the very psychology of Soviet patrols. By the mid-1980s, a subtle but profound change had taken hold within the Soviet submarine force. Patrol reports, once written with confidence in the ocean's protective depth, increasingly reflected caution, sometimes bordering on resignation. Crews reduced speed more frequently, avoided certain transit lanes, and maneuvered with the knowledge that an unseen presence might be charting their movements overhead. Commanders who had once relied on aggressive tactics now favored conservative profiles, aware that even small acoustic deviations could give an aircraft enough data to begin reconstructing a track. This psychological weight, operating in an environment where detection could occur without warning by an adversary that never revealed itself, shaped the internal culture of the force. Training emphasized noise discipline with a rigor that had not existed a decade earlier. Engineers were pressured to accelerate quieting programs. Strategic planners recalibrated assumptions about SSBN survivability and patrol effectiveness. The United States had not merely introduced a new weapon, it had altered the operational mindset of its rival. And when the Cold War ended, many of the archives that opened confirmed what Soviet crews had long suspected. The P3 Orion and its buoy networks had monitored their movements with a reach and consistency they could only guess at. Sound alone, processed, cataloged, and networked, had become one of the most decisive advantages in undersea warfare. For years, Soviet submarines believed the ocean concealed them. Instead, it had carried their signatures upward, where an aircraft waited patiently, listening.